The sun was bright that Sunday afternoon as Robert moved around his driveway, tools scattered on the ground beside him. He had only been in the Oakwood Heights neighborhood for 3 weeks, but it already felt like home. The large colonial house, with its white columns and red brick walls, stood proudly behind him, a dream he had worked 20 years to achieve. As the new FBI field office chief, Robert had moved from the busy streets of Washington, D.C. to this quiet suburb to take charge of the regional bureau. At 45, his salt and pepper hair showed the wisdom gained from years in law enforcement. But today, in his worn jeans and faded university t-shirt, he looked like any other homeowner doing weekend projects. Almost got it, he mumbled to himself, checking the instruction manual again. The electronic gate he was installing would add both security and a touch of class to his new home. Robert wiped sweat from his forehead and smiled, thinking about how far he'd come from the small apartment he grew up in. His mother would have been proud to see him now, a respected leader in the FBI with a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood. The tools clinked against each other as he sorted through them, looking for the right screwdriver. Birds chirped in the oak trees lining the street, and the smell of someone grilling floated through the air. Robert had met a few neighbors who welcomed him warmly, but he'd been too busy with the move and setting up his new office to attend any community gatherings. He carefully connected 2 wires, following the diagram step by step. Robert was known for his attention to detail. It's what made him so good at his job. When he solved cases, he used the same methodical approach, never rushing, always thorough. The control panel for the gate was almost ready to be mounted to the brick pillar at the edge of his property. Just a few more connections to make. Robert stood up to stretch his back, looking around at the other houses on the street. Most were built in the same colonial style as his, with perfectly trimmed lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. He had saved for years to afford a place in this neighborhood, known for its good schools and safe streets. It was exactly the kind of place he had always wanted to live in. Across the street, Nancy peered through her lace curtains, frowning at the man working in the driveway. At 52, she had lived in Oakwood Heights for 12 years and considered herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood standards. Her short blonde hair was perfectly styled even on weekends, and she wore her designer sweater despite being indoors, always ready to make an impression. "He's doing it again, Tom," she called to her husband, who was reading a newspaper in his recliner. "That man is installing some kind of gate without proper approval. I'm sure of it." Tom barely looked up. "Maybe he got permission, Nancy. Did you think of that?" Nancy sniffed and adjusted her pearl necklace. "I'm the secretary of the Homeowners Association. Nothing gets approved without crossing my desk first." She narrowed her eyes, watching Robert check something on his phone. "I didn't even know someone new had moved in until I saw the trucks. Must have bought directly from the Hendersons without an open house." She had been watching the new neighbor for days now, taking mental notes of his comings and goings. Sometimes he left early wearing nice suits, probably some kind of salesman, she thought. Other times, like today, he wore casual clothes that didn't fit her idea of what an Oakwood Heights resident should look like. "Remember how hard we had to fight to get approval for our garden fountain?" Nancy said, more to herself than to her husband. 3 meetings and a full presentation to the historical committee, but this guy thinks he can just move in and change things? At the last neighborhood meeting, Nancy had given a 20-minute presentation about preserving our community's special character, a speech that made several of the newer residents uncomfortable with its thinly veiled meaning. She kept albums of photos showing the neighborhood before it changed, as she put it. Nancy pulled out her phone and started typing a message to the neighborhood watch group. "Unknown man making property alterations on Oak Lane," she wrote, then deleted it, realizing few would share her concern. Instead, she decided to handle this herself. After all, that's what community watchdogs did. They protected what was theirs from outsiders who didn't understand the rules. Nancy grabbed her cell phone and house keys, straightening her sweater as she headed for the front door. "I'm going to have a word with him," she announced to Tom, who sighed without looking up from his newspaper. "Just leave the poor guy alone," Tom called after her. But Nancy was already marching across the street, her canvas shoes slapping against the pavement with each determined step. Robert was kneeling by the driveway entrance, carefully aligning the metal bracket that would hold the motor for the gate. He didn't notice Nancy approaching until her shadow fell across his work area. "Excuse me," Nancy said, her voice sharp like a teacher catching a student breaking rules. "Do you have permission to be doing that?" Robert looked up, surprised by the sudden interruption. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. He was a good foot taller than Nancy, with broad shoulders from his regular gym workouts. He noticed her take a small step back. "Good afternoon," he said with a polite smile. Years of dealing with difficult people had taught him to stay calm and respectful. "I'm just installing a security gate on my property. Is there a problem?" Nancy clutched her phone tighter. "This is a historic neighborhood. You can't just make modifications without approval from the homeowners association." She looked pointedly at the half-installed gate. "Who are you working for?" The question caught Robert off guard. "I'm not working for anyone. I own this house," he explained patiently. "I moved in about 3 weeks ago." Nancy's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "I find that hard to believe," she said with a small laugh. "I know everyone in this neighborhood. I'm the secretary of the homeowners association." Robert took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he'd faced someone who couldn't believe he belonged in an upscale neighborhood. After 20 years in law enforcement, he'd learned to recognize the look Nancy was giving him, that mixture of suspicion and disbelief. "Well, now you know me too," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert, the new owner of 425 Oak Lane. It's nice to meet you." Nancy ignored his outstretched hand. "Where are your permits for this construction?" "All exterior modifications need to be approved by the historical committee." "I have the paperwork inside if you'd like to see it," Robert offered, pointing toward his house. "The previous owners actually started the approval process before they sold to me. The committee gave final approval last week." Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't expected him to have the proper paperwork. "I would have known about that. I attend every meeting." "It might have been the special session on Tuesday," Robert suggested. "I couldn't attend personally because of work, but my real estate agent represented me." The conversation was growing more uncomfortable by the second. Neighbors walking dogs slowed their pace to watch the interaction. Robert felt the familiar weight of being scrutinized, of having to prove he belonged. Robert turned back to his work, hoping Nancy would take the hint and leave. He picked up his screwdriver and knelt down again, focusing on the bracket he was installing. But Nancy didn't budge. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of Robert and the gate. "What are you doing?" Robert asked, standing up again. "Documenting the unauthorized changes to the neighborhood," Nancy replied, taking another photo. "For the record." "I already told you I have approval," Robert said, his patience wearing thin. "And I'd appreciate if you didn't take pictures of me without asking first." Nancy took a step back onto the sidewalk. "This is a public street. I have every right to document what's happening in my neighborhood." Her voice had risen enough that a couple walking their dog on the other side of the street slowed down to watch. "Listen," Robert said, keeping his voice level despite his frustration. "If you have concerns about my gate installation, there are proper channels to address them. Taking pictures and confronting me isn't one of them." "If you really live here," Nancy shot back, "why haven't I seen you at any community meetings?" "Everyone who cares." Robert took a deep breath before answering. "I've been rather busy with the transition to my new position. Moving to a new city and starting a new job takes time." "And what job would that be?" Nancy asked with a hint of challenge in her voice. "What kind of work has you coming and going at all hours?" She had been watching his schedule, noting when his car left early or returned late at night. Robert considered whether to tell her about his FBI position, but decided against it. In his experience, it was better not to reveal too much to strangers, especially ones who seemed determined to find fault with him. "I work in law enforcement," he said simply. "Government service." Nancy laughed lightly. "Oh, I'm sure you do." Her tone made it clear she didn't believe him. She looked at the expensive house behind him, then back at his casual clothes and the tools scattered around the driveway. The contrast seemed to confirm her suspicions. Robert felt a familiar heaviness settle over him. Throughout his career, he had faced people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. As he rose through the ranks of the FBI, he encountered fewer such incidents, but they never completely stopped. Now, in what should have been a peaceful Sunday afternoon working on his new home, he was facing the same old story. Nancy pulled out her phone again, this time pressing buttons as if making a call. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly. "We'll see who really belongs here." Robert stood very still, his mind racing through possible scenarios. As an FBI chief, he knew countless police officers in the area, but the responding officers might not know him yet. He had been in town less than a month. He also knew how quickly these situations could escalate if not handled carefully. "That's unnecessary," he said calmly. "But you do what you feel you need to do." Nancy put the phone to her ear, turning slightly away from Robert but keeping her eyes on him. "Yes, hello," she said into the phone. "I need to report a suspicious person." Robert could hear Nancy's voice as she spoke to the 911 operator. She had moved a few steps away, but not far enough to prevent him from hearing her words. "Yes, there's a man tampering with property in Oakwood Heights," Nancy said, her voice trembling slightly. Robert noticed how she had suddenly changed her tone from demanding to something that sounded frightened. "He claims he lives here, but I've never seen him before, and he's installing some kind of gate without proper permits." Robert shook his head and knelt back down to continue working. There was no point in trying to argue further. He had been through this before, not exactly like this, but similar enough. As an FBI agent, he had learned to stay calm during tense situations. This was just another one to handle with patience. "No, he's not threatening me right now," Nancy continued, glancing at Robert. Then she lowered her voice, though not enough. "But he's a large man who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. I feel unsafe." Robert's hands tightened around his screwdriver. The lie stung, but he kept working. He had done nothing threatening, had even offered to show her his permits. But now he was being painted as dangerous, simply for existing in a space where Nancy thought he didn't belong. "Yes, I'll wait for officers to arrive," Nancy said, hanging up the phone. She smiled with a look of triumph, as if she had won some kind of contest. "The police will be here soon," she announced loudly, more for the benefit of the neighbors who were now openly watching from across the street. "That's fine," Robert replied without looking up. "I'll continue working while we—" "Wait." Nancy seemed disappointed by his calm reaction. She had expected fear, or anger, or for him to leave. Anything but this quiet confidence. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, occasionally checking her watch or looking down the street for the police cars. "You know, this gate will actually improve the look of the property," Robert said after a few minutes of awkward silence. The historical committee thought it matched the colonial style quite well. Nancy crossed her arms. "I don't believe you spoke to any committee." "Like I said, my real estate agent handled it," Robert explained patiently. "Ms. Chen, do you know her? She specializes in historical properties in this area." Nancy's expression changed slightly at the mention of the well-known real estate agent. Doubt flickered across her face for the first time, but she quickly pushed it aside. "Well, we'll let the police sort this out." A dog walker passed by, slowing to take in the scene. Nancy immediately waved him over. "Bill. Bill, come here," she called. The man reluctantly approached, his golden retriever pulling on the leash. "This man claims he bought the Henderson place, but I've never seen him at any meetings, and now he's installing this gate without permission." Bill looked uncomfortable. Actually, Nancy, I think I did see something about a gate approval. In last week's committee notes, I couldn't make the meeting, but they send out those email summaries, you know?" Nancy's face flushed red. "That's impossible. I would have known." "You were on vacation last week, remember?" Bill said carefully. "You mentioned something about visiting your sister in Florida?" Robert tried not to smile as he continued working. Maybe this situation wouldn't be as bad as he thought. But then he heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer by the second. His stomach tightened. No matter how many times he dealt with law enforcement as a fellow officer, being reported as a suspicious person always carried risk. Two police cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing, but sirens now silent. Robert put down his tools and stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible, a habit from years of law enforcement training. He knew how important it was to appear non-threatening in these situations. Two officers stepped out of the first car. One was tall with salt and pepper hair, the other younger with a buzz cut. They approached cautiously, taking in the scene. Nancy standing with her arms crossed, Robert by his half-installed gate, and the small group of neighbors who had gathered to watch. "Afternoon," the older officer said. His name tag read Wilson. "Someone called about a disturbance?" Nancy immediately stepped forward. "Yes, officer. This man claims he lives here, but he's installing this gate without proper approval from the homeowners association." When I questioned him, he became confrontational. Officer Wilson looked at Robert, his expression neutral but watchful. "Sir, can I ask what you're doing here?" "I'm installing a security gate on my property," Robert explained calmly. "I purchased this house last month from the Hendersons. I have all the proper permits and approvals. Do you have some ID?" the younger officer asked. His name tag read Diaz. "Of course," Robert said. He moved HI to. Both officers nodded, watching carefully as Robert pulled out his wallet. He opened it and handed his driver's license to Officer Wilson. Then, after a moment's consideration, he pulled out another card from behind his license. "This might also help explain things," Robert said, handing over his FBI credentials. "I'm the new field office chief downtown, just transferred from DC 3 weeks ago." Officer Wilson's eyes widened as he looked at the FBI badge and ID. He quickly handed the items back to Robert with newfound respect in his eyes. "Chief Johnson," he said, his tone completely different now. "We were briefed about your arrival to the department last week. Welcome to the area, sir." Officer Diaz looked equally surprised. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. We've heard great things about your work in Washington." Nancy stared in disbelief, her mouth slightly open. The neighbors who had gathered to watch were whispering among themselves. Bill, the dog walker, was unsuccessfully trying to hide a smile. "Thank you, officers," Robert said, tucking his wallet back into his pocket. "I appreciate your quick response. There seems to have been a misunderstanding with my neighbor here." Officer Wilson turned to Nancy, whose face had gone from confident to confused to mortified in the span of seconds. "Ma'am, did you verify that this gentleman wasn't the homeowner before calling 911? Nancy stammered. I've never seen him at any meetings, and no one told me someone new had moved in, and the gate has all proper approvals," Officer Diaz said. "We received notification from the historical committee last week. It was on the bulletin at the station because they mentioned improving security for the new FBI chief." Robert hadn't known that detail, but he wasn't surprised. The real estate agent had mentioned expediting the approval process because of his position, though he hadn't asked for special treatment. "Officers," Robert said, "I don't want to pursue any action against my neighbor. I understand she was concerned about the neighborhood." He was used to handling these situations diplomatically. In his position, making enemies of neighbors would only make his life more difficult. Nancy's face was now bright red. She looked at the ground, then at the officers, then at the watching neighbors. "I was just trying to protect our community," she said weakly. "How was I supposed to know he was with the FBI?" "That's not really the point, ma'am," Officer Wilson said quietly. "The point is that you reported someone as suspicious and claimed they were being threatening when they weren't." Robert stepped in. "Officers, since you're here, I wonder if we might use this as an opportunity. I've been meaning to reach out to the local department about some community engagement programs the Bureau is developing. Perhaps we could organize a neighborhood meeting about community safety and awareness." In the days that followed, the story of what happened between Robert and Nancy spread quickly through Oakwood Heights. Some neighbors stopped Nancy in the grocery store to ask for details. Others made a point to introduce themselves to Robert, bringing welcome gifts of cookies and plants for his new home. The local police department agreed to Robert's suggestion about a community meeting. They set it up for the following Saturday in the neighborhood park. Robert spent his evenings that week finishing his gate installation, occasionally waving to neighbors who drove by. Several stopped to admire the work, telling him it looked great with the house. Nobody mentioned the incident directly, but their friendly smiles told him they were on his side. Nancy, meanwhile, stayed mostly indoors. Her husband Tom encouraged her to apologize, but pride kept her from walking across the street. "I was just trying to protect our neighborhood," she told him over dinner. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" "That's exactly the point," Tom replied gently. "You didn't know him, but you assumed the worst." It was the first time in their marriage that Tom had directly challenged Nancy's behavior, and it left her with a lot to think about. Saturday arrived with perfect weather, sunny and warm with a light breeze. The park filled with neighbors carrying folding chairs and picnic blankets. Officer Wilson stood near a portable microphone chatting with Robert. Nancy arrived last, walking slowly with Tom by her side. She chose a seat in the back row, hoping to go unnoticed. "Good morning, everyone," Officer Wilson began. "Thank you for coming to our first community safety discussion. I'd like to introduce someone who many of you have heard about already, our new neighbor and the chief of the FBI field office, Robert Johnson." Applause broke out as Robert stepped forward. He looked different today in his crisp blue shirt and khaki pants, more like the federal agent he was than the casual homeowner fixing his gate. "Thank you all for the warm welcome," Robert said, with an easy smile. "Well, most of you anyway." A gentle laugh rippled through the crowd, and even Nancy managed a small smile. "I've worked in law enforcement for over 20 years," Robert continued. "And one thing I've learned is that true community safety isn't just about calling the authorities when you see something suspicious. It's about knowing your neighbors, understanding what belongs in your community, and, more importantly, who belongs." He went on to talk about the programs his office was developing: neighborhood watch training, community policing initiatives, and workshops on recognizing actual suspicious behavior versus personal bias. The crowd listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions. "The best neighborhoods aren't just safe because they have good security systems or police patrols," Robert concluded. "They're safe because neighbors look out for each other, all neighbors regardless of what they look like or when they moved in." After the formal presentation, people mingled with cookies and lemonade provided by the police department. Robert found himself surrounded by neighbors introducing themselves. From the corner of his eye, he could see Nancy standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, clutching a paper cup. When the circle around him finally thinned, Robert walked over to where Nancy stood. The conversation around them quieted as people watched curiously. "Hello, neighbor," Robert said, extending his hand. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'm Robert Johnson, and I'm looking forward to being part of this community." Nancy hesitated, then took his hand. "I'm Nancy Wilson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to apologize for what happened. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." "Apology accepted," Robert said simply. "Now I'm having a housewarming barbecue next weekend. The gate will be finished by then. I'd love for you and Tom to come." He glanced at her husband, who was watching with surprise. Nancy looked up, her eyes wide. "Really? After what I did?" "Everyone deserves a second chance," Robert said. "That's something else I've learned in my years of service. Sometimes people make mistakes based on wrong assumptions. What matters is what we learn from those mistakes." As the meeting broke up, Robert handed out his cards to the neighbors and the police officers. He had come to this neighborhood looking for a quiet place to call home, and despite the rocky start, he felt he had found it. The gate at his driveway was nearly complete, but the most important barriers, the ones between neighbors, were already coming down. In the months that followed, Oakwood Heights changed in small but important ways. The Homeowners Association, with Nancy still serving as secretary, created a new welcome committee to greet all newcomers regardless of their background. The police department used Robert's incident as a training example for officers responding to suspicious person calls. And Robert's barbecues became a neighborhood tradition, with his driveway gate standing open in welcome to everyone.